Hey everybody, welcome back. Johnny D here with DevSlopes.com, and we are continuing on with our Legend of DevSlopes awesome game. And today we're going to do some really cool stuff. You guys, we're going to actually work with the pathfinding that is built into Unity. And so we're going to be working with the nav mesh agents. We're going to be building our own creating the areas where our enemies are able to walk, working with their AI. And so we're going to do some cool stuff, all right? And you're going to see how easy it is to do this with Unity, all right? So let's go ahead and get into it. And so the first thing that we want to do is we want to be able to define the areas that our enemies are able to walk in, okay? And so that's the process of doing that is called baking. All right, and so what I want you to do is find your navigation window. That can be found here in Window and Navigation. All right, and you'll see there are three tabs here. We have Object, Bake, and Areas, okay? And so Object tab, that's where we're going to be selecting all of our objects in the scene, okay? And so we want to be able to tell Unity where we want our enemies to be able to move around, okay? And so what we're going to do is, you'll see if you click on one of these, so this is some of the objects in our scene. So for instance, a floor, you'll have a pop-up that says navigation static, okay? And we're going to want to check that for all of our items inside of our sample scene. And what that does is it just lets Unity know that this is going to be static. It's not going to be changing during gameplay, and so it knows that that is a place where the nav agent. So a nav agent is anything that has the ability to move around inside of this nav mesh, okay? And so a nav agent is able to know that this is navigation static, so it can use it, all right? And so we're going to actually set, there's a couple ways of doing it. We could select all of them inside of the scene like this, and then select navigation static. You could also do that in the inspector with these selected, and then up here in static, and you can do navigation static right here. Or you could select the entire sample scene and select navigation static, and it will ask you, do you want to enable navigation static for all the child objects? And you could say yes, change children. What we're going to do is I'm just going to select everything inside the sample scene all the way down to the bottom, and then in the navigation window I'm going to select navigation static. And then here you have the option for navigation area. And your three options are walkable, not walkable, and jump. So what does that mean? Over here in the areas tab, we have a few built-in areas, okay? And we have walkable, not walkable, jump, and then you can put in your own. So for instance, if you had areas that were, say, maybe like quicksand or something, you know, and you could put a cost of 5 on that. And then you had mud, and you could put a cost of 4. So then when you selected specific areas of your map in object and assigned quicksand or mud, you'll see that the cost, whichever cost is lower, that is going to be the path that they are most likely to choose. So they're going to choose the path of least resistance. So if there's a walkable area, they'll choose that. If there's not, then they'll go for the mud, and if not, then they'll go for the quicksand, okay? But we just want everything to be walkable, so that's what we're going to select. And so that's our objects, and that's our areas. And so once you have your objects all set, and they're set to navigation static and walkable, then we're going to bake it. So baking is the act of you know, getting it ready, completely ready for the nav agents to walk on. All right, and so what we have here is we have a few parameters that we'll talk about. You have agent radius, and so that is the radius of each of your nav agents, or in our case, our enemies. And so you want to try and maybe you have a small enemy and a large enemy, like we do. We have our ranger, and then we also have our tanker. And so what you want to do is you want to keep the radius so that it's about the same or an average between the two. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to say 0.75. And so what this is it's a measurement of how close to the walls navigation agents are able to get, okay? And then our agent height, 2 is fine. And our max slope, we'll try 45 and see if we need to adjust from there. But the max slope is the maximum angle of a slope that a nav agent can go up before it considers it a wall. Okay, so if you had like in this case, our max slope is currently set to 45 degrees. So if they came up to a slope that was 46 degrees, they're just gonna be like, nope, can't do it, too steep. That's a wall to me. And then the step height is the highest bump or highest step that a nav agent is able to easily traverse, okay? All right, so once you have all of that set up, you can just go ahead and press bake. Boom. And then if you look in your scene, you'll see that we have this blue area showing up, and that is our nav mesh. That means that anything that is blue here, our nav agents, in this case our enemies, will be able to traverse. So let's take a look at what we got. We have, we are able to walk along all this area. They're not able to go into there. Right now they're not able to climb the stairs, and I wonder if that's because these steps are steeper than 45 degrees. So let's go ahead and increase that to 60. And then you're going to see that it's going to tell us that our step height conflicts with the max slope, makes it some slopes unwalkable. So it suggests increasing this to 0.76. So let's go ahead and try that. And then each time you make a change, you have to rebake it. Okay, so let's see if this helps us out with our stairs. So I'm going to press bake again. And sure enough, now you can see that we're able to climb up these stairs. Still not these ones, and I wonder if that's because this is a really narrow staircase. We're able to climb this one over here. Whoops. We're able to climb over here. And I think that's okay for now. You guys can play with this to get it all sorted out, but really the only thing that I'm concerned about is having this area down here be walkable, because this is where we're going to be spawning our enemies, and this is where we're going to be having the fighting action take place, okay? So this whole area is now walkable by our nav agents. And so the next thing to do is we need to tell our enemies that they are nav agents. All right, so what we're going to do, oh, one more thing that I want to show you is, since we set things as navigation static, let's see, I'm going to grab this house and we're just going to move it over here. And as you can see, the area, the nav mesh has not recalculated. So it would continue to assume that this is an area that they cannot walk and that this is an area that they can walk. If you wanted to move something, you have to rebake it. So there you go. And I'm just going to move that back and rebake again. All right, so good. Okay, so now we need to tell our enemies that they are indeed nav agents, and that's pretty easy. All we got to do is select our enemy. We'll start with the tanker, come back to our inspector window, and add component. And I'm going to type in nav mesh agent and select it. And we have some options to go through here. And if you look up in our scene here, you'll see that a green cylinder has shown up around our tanker. And so the radius is easy enough to understand. That's just the radius of the nav mesh agent. So if they'll only come that close within the perimeter of the nav mesh, and we'll set that to maybe 1.25. That looks like that fits him pretty well. Our height looks good, that's 2. So if we had like a low-hanging bridge or a cave or something, and the nav mesh was less than 2 units of height, then our tanker here would not be able to go under it. And then our speed, I think 3.5 is a little fast for our tanker, so we're going to drop this down to 2. Angular speed is how fast it can turn. 120 is fine. We'll go for that with for the default, and we'll be able to come in here and tweak these later on to see how the gameplay feels, if we need something to go faster or slower, turn quicker or slower. And the acceleration is how fast it can accelerate. Stopping distance is how close it will get to the edge of the navigation area. You know, sometimes there might be cases where you don't want it to go right up to the edge. You want it to stop within a certain distance. And we'll leave auto braking on. And for the obstacle avoidance, you could have varying degrees of quality. We'll just go ahead and leave it on high quality. This is a relatively small game. We don't need to be worrying too much about processor speed. But if you had, 1,000 enemies, then you might want to reduce the quality. And so I think this is looking good. So next up, we're just going to do the same thing for our other couple enemies. So I'm going to go to soldier now and add component, add the nav mesh agent, and whoops. So there's this guy. I think his radius is okay. It seems to enclose him pretty well. Speed, let's say 3. He's going to be faster than the tanker. Acceleration and everything else is fine. And so that's good for the soldier. Now we just got to add our nav mesh agent for our ranger. So we're going to add component and nav mesh agent. Radius is fine for him. Height is fine. Speed, let's make him in between the tanker and the soldier. So say 2.5 for his speed. Acceleration, everything else looks fine. The defaults are usually pretty good for your nav mesh agents. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that. And now we need to write a script for our enemies to be able to move. And so we'll need to set a target and tell them what to follow. And so in our scripts folder, go ahead and right click on scripts, create C# script, and say enemy move. All right, and go ahead and open that up. Just gonna pull that over here. All right, let's get started. How it works is we need a target for them to move to. Okay, so we are going to need a reference to our hero, serialize field. And we're gonna call this, and it's gonna be of type transform. And we're gonna call it player. And so back in the Unity editor, we are going to drag in our hero into this transform slot. And then we are also going to need a reference to our nav mesh agent. I'm going to just call this nav. And then I'm going to put in also a private reference to our animator, which we don't have set up quite yet, but we're going to work on that in a second. And then in start, we're going to grab references to our nav and animator. So we're going to say anim is equal to get component of type animator. And then we're also going to get a reference to our navigation. So nav is equal to get component nav mesh agent. All right, perfect. And then to make sure that we remember to drag our hero into our player slot, we're going to do an assertion, and we're going to do that on awake. And so to use assertions, we need to use the namespace using Unity engine dot assertions. And in awake, we are going to say assert dot is not null player. So that's just telling us, make sure that this is not null when we start up. All right, and then in update, All right, you guys ready to write all the code for the artificial intelligence and making sure that the enemies avoid obstacles and turn and do all of that stuff? All right, you ready? So nav dot set destination player dot position. And that's it. That is how easy it is to get pathfinding up and running for our enemies. Just to break it down though, so we're calling a method on our navmesh agent, which is set destination, and then all we gotta do is pass in the position of our target, which is the player. So save that, come back to Unity, and for each of our enemies, we are going to add the component of enemy move and drag in the hero to our player slot. For soldier, add enemy move, drag in the hero for the player slot. And for the ranger, add component, enemy move, and drag in our hero for the player slot. And save it and give it a run and see what happens. I'm going to maximize this. And we should see our enemies chasing after us. And look at that. That is awesome. And just like we can see, let's see here, the soldier is fastest, followed by the ranger, and then followed by the tanker. And that is stinking cool. All right, guys, run around the level, play around with this, and just be amazed at your game-making skills so far, all right? So I'm gonna press play and exit out of gameplay, switch off maximize on play. And what do we wanna do now? So pretty cool that they're following us around, but they looked pretty static, you know, they were just kind of sliding along. We wanna be able to add our animations to them, all right? So let's go ahead and do that. So we talked about animations that we did on our hero. So we're going to do something similar for our enemies, all right? So come to our assets and our animator folder, and we're going to create new animator controller, okay? And this one will put on the tanker, okay? So we just created an animator controller for our tanker. So go ahead and click over to our animator window. And we now have our two states, our any state and our entry state. And if you don't know where the animator window is, it's just right here up in window and animator, okay? And I'm not sure if I talked about any state last time, and so any state can be triggered from literally any state, okay? So if you were walking and all of a sudden you die, you might have a trigger set to die. If you were doing anything else and you need something to happen from any state, that's where you would have a transition from, okay? And we're actually gonna make use of that right now. So let's see here what we need. We are going to open up our models and go to our tankers, since that's what we're working with. And we're going to throw in all of the animations that we're going to work with in this game, even though we're only going to be using a couple right now. So we're going to start with walk, and we're going to drag that in. And walk is going to be our default entry animation. And that's because right when they spawn, they're going to start pursuing our hero. We don't need them to really have any startup actions or anything like that, okay? And so that's our entry, and we actually could see this already working for our tanker if we apply the controller. So let's go ahead and do that. So I clicked on the tanker in the hierarchy, and for the controller, I'm going to click and select or circle select and choose tanker and press play. And there you go. You see our tanker now has animation for walk. And he's coming after us. So that looks great. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish up the rest of our animations and transitions here. And like I said, we're only going to be using the walk right now, but let's just go ahead and set up the rest of this, and we'll have it set up for when we need it. So what else do we need? We're going to need attack, we're going to need hurt. We're going to need, oops, we're going to need idle, and we're going to need die. Okay, idle and die. Okay, so how we're going to do this is when the enemy attacks, we're just going to play the attack animation, and then we're going to segue transition straight back into walk, okay? So I'm going to right click on attack and say make transition and connect that to walk. And you remember in the last, for the hero, we had specific conditions for our animations. So when we weren't, we were checking if we were walking, and if we were walking, then we would play the walking animation. If we weren't walking, then we would play the idle animation. But in this case, we don't really need a condition on this transition, because once we attack, it'll just flow. All we want it to do is just transition straight back into walk, regardless of what else is happening. So we don't need a condition on that. Same thing for hurt. So once we're hurt, the guy, we'll play the animation for him to get knocked back and get hurt, and then we'll just simply transition straight back into walking, unless we die or the game is over. So in that case, we're going to create a couple of triggers. And so here in the parameters, we're going to say trigger, and we're going to call it enemy die. And our second trigger is hero die. So if the enemy dies, then we are going to make a transition from any state. He could die during walking, he could have died during an attack, or while he was hurt, so that transition is going to be from any state to die. And the condition on it is enemy die. That's our trigger. And then when the game is over, or when the hero gets killed, when the player dies, we don't want the enemies to still be, hacking at the body. We're going to set them to just idle, okay? So when the hero dies, they're just going to switch to hanging around, okay? So we're going to create a transition from any state to idle, and that condition is going to be hero die. So when the hero dies, we go to idle. When the enemy dies, we play the die animation. When we attack, we play the attack and then just go straight back into walk. When we're hurt, we play the hurt animation and then just go straight back to walk. Okay, so now we have our whole animator controller set up for our tanker. And now you could go and do all of this work all over again for the soldier and ranger, but thankfully Unity has us covered on that, and we can use what is called an animator override controller, okay? So here in our animator folder, we're gonna select create and animator override controller, okay? And I'm going to name this soldier AOC for animator override controller. And so I have it selected here, and then here up in the inspector, you'll see soldier AOC. And so what we're gonna do is it wants a base controller. And so what we're gonna do is we are going to select the tanker. So basically it's kind of like inheritance. We are inheriting the behavior of the tanker animator controller that we just created, but we're able to select our own animations that are specific to our soldier. But it has the same logic. When the soldier attacks, it does the same thing. When the soldier dies, it does the same thing. And so that's why we use similar names, and that's why we're able to use this animator override controller. So we are just going to swap out the animations that the soldier uses instead of the tanker. So for walk, I'm going to use the circle select, and there's going to be 4 or 5. There are going to be 4 walks, so we want to make sure we're selecting the right one, which you can see right here. So currently is the tanker walk, and we want the soldier walk, so that's this one right here. So I'm going to double click it, and I just swapped out the walk. Then for attack, I'm going to make sure I got the soldier attack selected. You can see it here, right here, soldier. I'm going to select that one. For hurt, same thing, find the one for the soldier, double click. Same thing for idle, make sure it's for the soldier, double click. And for die, make sure that it's for the soldier and double click. And now we have all of the animations set up for the soldier as well. So that is pretty cool. And then we're going to do the same thing for the ranger. So right click, create new animator override controller. And this one is going to be called Ranger AOC. And again, we are going to select the tanker and override his animations. So walk for the ranger is this one right here. Attack for the ranger right there. Hurt for the ranger. It's this one right here. Idle for the ranger right there. And die for the ranger right there. All right, perfect. So now when we play, well, first we have to assign our controllers, right? So for the soldier, come here in the animator, circle select for the controller, and select soldier AOC. For the ranger, come here to the inspector window, animator, controller, and we want the ranger AOC. All right, so that's good. I'm gonna save, I'm gonna maximize on play, and press play. Now we have all of our guys following after us, and their animations are working, and it looks super great. That is awesome. All right, so I hope you guys are having fun with this, and that wraps it up for this video. Just to recap what we learned, we went over how to bake our navigation scenes, how to get it all set up for our nav mesh agents to know where they are able to walk, and then we created our script for our enemy movement, and that is done by setting a nav mesh agent for component for each of your enemies, creating a reference to the player so that you can set the destination for them to the player.position. And then we, created animator controllers and set animations for each of our enemies. And so now we got a really cool little game set up. We got our enemies following us, and we will continue on our merry way in the next video. This is Johnny B with devslopes.com signing off.